All right, 2 Samuel 12, let's call this one righteousness means owning our unrighteousness, because in this chapter, David seems to have gotten away with it until the prophet Nathan comes to visit him with what seems innocently enough to be a story. But he tells them a story that seems to implicate a man who was very rich in comparison to a man who was not so much. The man who was not so much had a single ewe lamb in comparison to the riches of the rich man. But when the rich man had a visitor come by, he was unwilling to take from his abundance and instead took the single ewe lamb from the man who had doted over it and cared for it. And he prepared that poor man's lamb for his guests. Nathan basically posed this question to David: what should happen to that man? David, not needing much prompting, said that wickedness justifies the man's death and restitution fourfold, which is going to be a very interesting statement that is going to seem to shape the way in which God is going to respond to David in the next chapter. And so from there, Nathan's going to tell David what God is going to do to him. And we're going to talk about that, God willing, in the next chapter, where we're going to get a picture not only of what God is going to do, but how he is going to go about it. And as we mentioned before, it's a very chilling picture of God's judgment, even on one of his own servants. But in this chapter, we're going to go on to see the way in which David had a point of betrayal. And it's something I think is common to all of us. When the word says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, one of the difficult things to admit is each of us may have a point at which we would betray just about anyone if we were put under the right amount of pressure. Why do I say that? Well, because Simon Peter, in Jesus' service, never thought he betrayed Jesus. But Jesus said this in warning his disciples to watch and pray. He said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so here we're seeing likewise, even in David, a man after God's own heart, a king who is establishing Israel the way God wants it established, had a point of betrayal. But the more important thing here may be his point of recovery. When we see in Proverbs chapter 28, verse 13, it's going to say, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. So even though we have David's point of betrayal exposed in these chapters, we're going to see that his point of recovery is going to begin with the fact that Nathan doesn't have to pull teeth to get David to admit that he is the man that even he would admit deserved death. The thing, however, that's going to distinguish David from Saul, who likewise sinned greatly, is the fact that it's never going to seem that Saul actually forsakes the sins that he confesses, understanding that twice he's caught in a compromising position that's finally going to provoke him to confess, but he's going to confess without actually forsaking the wrong he was doing. As we mentioned before, he had surrounded himself with the types of counselors who seemed to realize if they just gave Saul long enough, he, instead of forsaking his wrongdoing, he held on to it in subtle ways that might not have been obvious to everyone around him, but to those who knew him, they knew he was still committed to doing wrong. Whereas in this chapter, we're going to see that David is not only going to confess to Nathan, this is going to mark the point of his recovery, because he is not simply confessing. The next few chapters are going to show us the way in which he is going to forsake the wrong that he's done. And an interesting irony at the end of the chapter is a story that might seem like it's out of place, where it talks about Joab conquering an Ammonite city. And instead of going forward and just conquering it, he's going to realize that, wait, if I take this city, I might get credit for it. So he's going to send a messenger to David, even though the thing with Uriah displeased Joab, or seems to displease Joab greatly. He didn't lose respect for David to the point where he would begin to betray David. But instead of doubling down on his sin and going behind David's back to kill Abner, this time he's going to go above and beyond to make sure that David gets the honor for the conquest of the Ammonite city, giving us an example of one who, at least for now, seems to have genuinely forsaken his past sins of betraying David. So even though that story of Joab might seem to be an outlier in this chapter that otherwise details Nathan confronting David with his own sin, it's actually consistent with what David's going to have to do going forward in setting an example of the way he's going to have to not only confess his sins, but forsake them. And the long road back to recovery is going to start with a very tragic death of the first child he could have had with Bathsheba in this chapter. But that's only the beginning of the tragedy that's ahead for David on his road to recovery.